Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I never thought I'd end up homeless at 26, staying in a hotel paid for by my best friend. But here I am, my face still slightly swollen from where my mother slapped me 3 times last week. It's strange how life can change so drastically in just a few days. Though, if I'm honest, this has been building up for the past 3 years, ever since my father passed away. My father was a successful real estate developer. He built his empire from scratch, working tirelessly to ensure his family would never want for anything. We were incredibly close. He taught me everything I know about business and property management. When I was younger, he'd take me to his construction sites, explaining how everything worked, teaching me the value of honest work and integrity. He always said, "Everything I build is for you, my child." When he died unexpectedly from a heart attack, I was devastated. But I tried to stay strong, knowing he'd want me to carry on his legacy. What I didn't expect was my mother's dramatic change in behavior after his death. She became someone I couldn't recognize anymore. It started small. She'd sell pieces of furniture from our house, claiming they brought back too many painful memories. Then she began selling my father's watches and cufflinks, items he specifically left for me. I didn't argue at first, understanding that grief affects people differently. But then I discovered she had sold 2 of the apartment buildings my father had left me in his will. I found out about this completely by accident. One of my father's old business partners called me to discuss renovating my property, only to be confused when I had no idea what he was talking about. That's when I learned my mother had been systematically selling off my inheritance behind my back. When I confronted her about the Lancaster Street apartments, asking her why she sold property that was left to me in Dad's will, she exploded. She yelled that I shouldn't question her, claiming that as my mother, she knew what was best for the family. When I pointed out that what she was doing was illegal and that she couldn't sell property that wasn't hers to sell, she turned it around on me. She accused me of being a gold digger and said my father would be disappointed in me. That last comment stung more than I could express. She knew exactly how to hurt me by bringing up my father. After that confrontation, things got progressively worse. She started spreading rumors within our family about how I had become money-obsessed and disrespectful. But I knew I had to take action, so I quietly contacted a lawyer and began gathering evidence of her illegal sales. Last week, everything came to a head when she discovered I'd been meeting with a lawyer. She burst into my room screaming about betrayal and ingratitude. When I stood my ground, she slapped me 3 times across the face, something she had never done before. The physical pain wasn't as bad as the realization that I no longer recognized the woman who raised me. I waited 4 days, got my important documents in order, and left. That's when the phone calls started pouring in. Every relative seemed to have an opinion about how I was destroying the family. Then my uncle, my mother's brother-in-law, called. The conversation with my uncle was frustrating. He insisted I was making a terrible mistake and that 2 wrongs don't make a right. When I tried to explain my side, he wouldn't listen. He just kept talking about how he'd seen people take the path I was on and how it never ended well. He even brought up my father, saying he wouldn't want this. He went on quoting religious texts, trying to guilt me into returning home. When he finally paused for breath, I took my chance. I thanked him for his concern, but then explained something crucial, that in our religion I was considered an orphan since my father passed away, and my mother was stealing from me. I reminded him what our religion says about stealing from orphans. The impact was immediate. He went completely silent. When he finally spoke again, his whole tone had changed. He asked me to explain everything, actually listening this time. After I told him the full story, he was horrified. Word spread quickly through the family after that. Suddenly, the phone calls changed from demands that I return home to offers of support and assistance. Several relatives even came forward with information about other properties my mother had been trying to sell, which helped strengthen my legal case. The final blow came when my lawyer discovered my mother had been forging my signature on documents. With the overwhelming evidence and family support, the court ruled in my favor. All remaining properties were returned to my control, and my mother was ordered to repay the value of the ones she had already sold. She's still trying to contact me, sending messages about how sorry she is and how she was only trying to protect me. But I've learned that sometimes the people who claim to protect you are the ones you need protection from. I'm now living in one of my father's apartments, managing his properties just like he taught me, and building my own legacy, one founded on honesty and integrity, just like he would have wanted. My grandpa's always been the quiet type. He moved to that farmhouse about 30 years ago after retiring from the military. Most people in town just knew him as the old farmer who sold the best corn and tomatoes at the local market every weekend. What they didn't know was that he kept his military training sharp, even in his 70s. The farm itself is pretty isolated, sitting at the end of a dirt road about 20 minutes outside of town. My dad and I used to visit every other weekend when I was growing up. I remember spending hours helping him tend to the vegetables and learning how to shoot cans with his old rifle. He always said that out here, you need to know how to protect yourself because the police station is too far away to rely on them. The whole incident started on a Tuesday night. My grandpa was in his usual spot sitting in his rocking chair on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air when he noticed something off. There were two unmarked vans slowly making their way up his driveway, their headlights off. At first, he thought maybe someone was lost. It happened sometimes with tourists trying to find the camping grounds a few miles away. But his instincts told him something wasn't right. He quietly got up and went inside to grab his rifle, the same one he'd used to teach me shooting. Just as he positioned himself by the window, 5 men in black clothes jumped out of the vans. They were carrying weapons and moving like they knew what they were doing. That's when the first shot came through his window. My grandpa, being the tactical genius he is, immediately dropped to the floor. He could hear them yelling to each other. One shouted that the front door was locked and they were moving to the back. Another one ordered them to break it down, convinced their target was inside. My grandpa army crawled to a better position, one where he could see both the front and side of the house. He knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew his house better than anyone. He heard one of them yell that their boss had said this was where the snitch was hiding and they needed to check every room. That's when my grandpa realized they had the wrong house. But these guys weren't exactly looking to have a civilized conversation about their mistake. The back door splintered open and 2 of them rushed in. My grandpa took his shot, clean and precise. The first guy went down with a wound to the leg. One of the others started shouting that they had a man down. The second guy tried to return fire, but ended up shooting a family photo instead. My grandpa's second shot caught him in the shoulder, and he dropped his weapon, screaming. One of them started to say something about how this wasn't right, but another quickly told him to shut up and keep moving. But my grandpa wasn't done. He'd positioned himself behind his heavy oak cabinet, and when the third guy came running through the kitchen, he used the butt of his rifle to knock him right off his feet. The guy's head hit the floor so hard he was out cold instantly. That's when one of them got lucky. A stray bullet grazed my grandpa's arm, but instead of slowing him down, it just made him angrier. My grandpa shouted back at them, telling them they'd picked the wrong house and that he had enough ammo to keep this going all night. His voice must have carried some serious weight because the remaining gangsters started backing up real quick. Their leader started yelling for everyone to fall back. Another one tried to say something about this not being the right place, but was quickly told to shut up and move. They scrambled back to their vans like cockroaches when you turn on the lights. My grandpa kept his rifle trained on them until they disappeared down the road, tires screeching and all. After they left, my grandpa called the police and then my dad. Turns out their actual target was hiding in a farmhouse about 5 miles down the road. Some gangster who turned informant against his crew. They'd gotten their intel mixed up and hit the wrong place. The police found the 2 injured guys my grandpa had shot still lying in the house. Both of them survived, and they sang like canaries once they realized how badly they'd messed up. The guy they knocked out had a concussion but also decided to cooperate with the police. When my dad arrived, he found Grandpa sitting in his rocking chair again, holding a cloth to his arm like it was just a paper cut. Grandpa just shrugged it off, saying he'd had worse scratches from the rose bushes out back. The police used the information from the 3 captured gangsters to raid the Wright house the next day. They found their target, along with enough evidence to put the whole crew away for a long time. The other 2 who escaped were caught trying to skip town a week later. My grandpa still sits in that rocking chair every evening, keeping watch over his farm. Only difference is now the whole town knows not to mess with the old farmer at the end of the dirt road. Last I heard, even the local troublemakers go out of their way to avoid his property. Dad says the look on the police officers' faces when they arrived and found 3 trained gangsters taken down by a 73-year-old farmer was priceless. They actually asked him if he'd be interested in teaching some tactical courses at the academy. He turned them down, of course, said he had tomatoes that needed tending to. I've been living in Japan for the past 3 years, working as an English teacher at a private school. The job isn't exactly what I dreamed of doing when I majored in Asian studies, but it pays well enough and lets me experience the culture I've been fascinated with since childhood. Plus, my apartment is just a 30-minute train ride from Tokyo, which is pretty convenient. This morning started like any other. I was heading to work dressed in my usual business attire when I stopped at my regular station to catch the train. I always arrive early to avoid the morning rush, so the station was relatively quiet. That's when this middle-aged tourist lady approached me. She was wearing what looked like expensive clothes and carrying a Louis Vuitton handbag, trying her best to look important. I could tell she was a tourist from the way she kept looking around, confused at all the Japanese signs. She called out to me like she was calling a waiter, demanding that I come over to her. I walked over, thinking maybe she needed directions. Without even making eye contact, she thrust a handful of cash at me and ordered me to put the money in the machine for her. No greeting, no please, nothing. Just an order, like I was her servant or something. I asked her to repeat herself, not quite believing what I was hearing. She clarified that she needed tickets to Tokyo Station and wanted me to handle the money and get them for her. In my 3 years here, I'd helped plenty of tourists. Most were polite, apologetic even, about not understanding the system. But this woman, I refused, telling her she could do it herself and pointing out that the machine had an English option. Her face turned red, and she stepped closer to me. She insisted that I had to do this for her, claiming she didn't have time to figure out these complicated machines, and demanded that I just take her money and get her the tickets. I explained that I wasn't a station employee, just another commuter trying to get to work. I suggested she visit the station office if she needed help. She argued that since I obviously spoke English and looked like I knew what I was doing, giving me money should be enough to get my help. I told her that while I'd be happy to show her how to use the machine, I wouldn't do it for her, especially not with that attitude. She became indignant, shouting about being a paying customer. I had to remind her that she wasn't a customer at all, just a tourist, trying to order around a complete stranger in a foreign country. I pointed out that while station staff were paid to help people, I wasn't. At this point, she was causing quite a scene, and a station employee noticed and started walking over. She continued ranting about how, in her country, people help tourists and complained about terrible service. I responded by explaining that this wasn't about service since I didn't work there, and that in Japan we treat people with respect, especially strangers. The station employee reached us, bowing politely and asking if everything was okay. Before the tourist could start complaining, I explained the situation in Japanese. The employee nodded understanding and politely offered to help the woman purchase her tickets. The tourist lady responded with a snide comment about finally finding someone who knew how to do their job. As she walked away with the station employee, I could hear her muttering about rude foreigners and terrible customer service. The irony of her calling me a rude foreigner while being the epitome of an entitled tourist was not lost on me. I caught my train as usual, but the encounter left me thinking about the audacity of some people. The station employee later told me that the tourist complained about me, but he just smiled and nodded while helping her buy the wrong tickets to a station in the opposite direction of Tokyo. Being a developer means my mind is wired to look for loopholes and exploit them, a trait my son clearly inherited. My wife and I had been struggling with our 3-year-old sleep schedule for months. The kid was brilliant, already solving basic math problems and reading simple words, but his early bird tendencies were becoming a problem. Every morning at 5 a.m., like clockwork, he'd bounce into our room, full of energy and ready to start the day. No amount of explaining that it was too early seemed to work. We tried everything: blackout curtains, white noise machines, even one of those sunrise alarm clocks. But nothing stuck. My wife, who works as a pediatric nurse, was especially concerned about his sleep patterns. She'd seen plenty of kids suffering from sleep deprivation, and we didn't want our son heading down that path. After an exhausting week of pre-dawn wake-ups, we came up with what we thought was a foolproof plan. That evening, we sat down with our son to show him his gift. I excitedly showed him the clock we got for his room. His eyes widened with interest as he asked if it was really his own clock. My wife chimed in, telling him that we were going to play a fun number game with it. Our son's eyes lit up at the mention of numbers. He was obsessed with them, constantly counting everything from his toys to the steps on our staircase. I explained the rules to him, saying that when he wakes up, he should look at the first number on the clock, and if he sees a 7, that means it's morning time and he can get up. He asked for confirmation about the number 7, and my wife agreed, adding that if he sees any other number, he needs to stay in bed and try to sleep more. He seemed to understand, nodding enthusiastically. We went through our usual bedtime routine: story, hugs, and tucking him in. The clock read 8:22 p.m. when we turned off the lights. I reminded him one last time to wait for the 7, and he happily agreed. We had barely made it to the living room when we heard tiny footsteps in the hallway. Our son emerged, wearing the biggest, most mischievous grin I'd ever seen. He proudly announced that he saw a 7 and could get up now. When my wife asked him where he saw the 7, he pointed at the clock, which now read 8:27. He'd found the loophole in our instructions. We'd only told him to look for a 7, not specifically 7 as the first number. I told him that while he was very clever, he knew that wasn't what we meant. He insisted that we had said 7, and my wife, trying to contain her laughter, had to admit that we did indeed say exactly that. I picked him up and gave him a big hug. It was like looking at a tiny version of myself, already thinking outside the box. I explained the new rules to him, saying he could only get up when the first number is a 7, and asked if we had a deal. He reluctantly agreed, showing slight disappointment at his loophole being closed. We took him back to bed, this time being much more specific about the rules. The next morning he actually waited until 7:05 to come get us, a massive improvement from his usual 5 a.m. wake-up calls. That incident became a running joke in our family. Whenever someone finds a clever workaround to a rule, we say they're pulling a 7, our own little family code for creative problem solving. Now that he's older, our son's knack for finding loopholes has evolved into a genuine talent for logical thinking. He's top of his class in math and science, and I have a feeling he might follow in my footsteps as a developer one day. Though I might need to watch out, with his skills at finding exploits, he could end up being better than me before he even finishes high school. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.